I'd like to start off this video by defining what culture really is. I would like to view it as the glue that holds an ethnic group or nation or civilization together, primarily including things like art, language, politics, and government, as well as fundamentally core principles such as religion, ethical systems, and a shared belief about the world that binds them together. I'm gonna use this first as an into what I'm about to say, because it's not really that controversial, and a fairly large amount of people already believe in it, so it'd be a good segue into things that are more controversial. In the past few decades, you can notice an ongoing pattern where art and media has slowly become worse, or perhaps rapidly, actually. There has been a pretty small amount of classic movies since 2010, and pretty much none since 2020. Whereas every other decade has had numerous classics in cinema. Art has experienced a similar effect too, with modern art being much more simplistic, bland, and boring, which has been occurring ever since the CIA-funded quote-unquote artist and wife-beater Pollock had become mainstream in the 70s. This phenomena has become much more worse since then, of course, culminating in the infamous Memphis art style, also known as the Globo Homo art style. I mean, that's what some people call it anyways. A very small amount of people, actually. Architecture has also become pretty bland. You can prove this by just walking out in a city and then looking at photos of cities in, like, say, the 50s, for example, and compare them. I'd like to start this off by saying that I am a former nihilist myself. I even own a copy of the book, The Myth of Sisyphus, which is essentially a nihilist book, but I'll get more into that later. It would be good to define what nihilism is, because people have a pretty misinformed view of what it is, and I think they'd be surprised to know how common it actually is. Essentially, nihilism is the rejection of core principles of society, particularly meaning and religion. There are 6 types of nihilists. I'll rank them from most common to least common. First of all, there's nihilists who don't describe themselves as nihilists and are generally atheist and leftist and do not think about meaning or nihilism or things such as. Then there are pessimistic nihilists, which is the general stereotype of what nihilists are, who despair due to the lack of meaning of life, in their opinion, and are generally depressed and anhedonic. Then there's optimistic nihilists who embrace the lack of meaning, which branches into 2 groups: absurdists, who also embrace the lack of meaning, but particularly the struggles of life. The Myth of Sisyphus comes from that group's creator, Albert Camus, who wrote about the absurdity of life and how one should embrace the suffering of it, I guess. That's just from what I remember. Then there's also existentialists who believe that people can create their own meaning, and anarcho-nihilists who incorporate nihilism into politics and reject most of the foundational principles of society, which also includes things much more controversial, such as morals, and things like that. Most of the people in these groups, like I said, don't call themselves nihilists, but are nihilists. And as Western culture has corrupted and decayed further, so too has nihilism increased. Since nihilism rejects the core principles of civilization, it is inherently destructive. The root word of nihilism, nihil, meaning nothing, or means nothing, since nihilism is against these traditional values that build society and organize things and people and create something more than themselves. To quote Fulton J. Sheen, because I think it is a pretty good quote, you cannot build down. I've talked about this more in my video, Why Culture is Dead, but to put it briefly, ever since the early feminist movements, or perhaps even since the French and American revolutions, there have been several social revolutions against cultural principles that were once held by all civilizations and groups of people since the beginning of time. Among all of them, there have been pretty strong ties to nihilism and a certain other ideology, but in a group of people, but I'm not going to mention that on YouTube. These social revolutions start off with a basic premise, but rapidly growing further. For example, feminism started with the position that women should vote, which was already controversial, particularly to women, the primary audience. Then it evolved to women should abandon their main roles in society of taking care of children, housemaking, and things like that, and should work. And now it has shifted to a very large, abstract, almost conspiratorial view that men and masculinity are inherently bad and responsible for much of the world's problems and things like that. These social movements seem to work deliberately using tactics that went over many at first and then push further and further until something which was once common sense is now very unpopular. I mentioned at the start of this video that culture is sort of like the glue that holds people together, and throughout all of these events that I've talked about, many of the aspects of our culture have been seemingly deliberately targeted. A subtle way of hypothetically dominating a nation or a civilization or a group of people would be to destroy the fabric of their society, so that it would be easier to control it. By replacing everything, like even objective knowledge, with nothing, you can easily brainwash them and inject your own beliefs, or things you would want them to believe would be better to say. By destroying culture, you can manufacture something else that benefits you more. Humans evolved to have basic culture and spirituality. This is going back to prehistoric times, and the culture and spirituality has evolved to hold certain beliefs, as I've talked about in this video. When these things are taken away, you end up with people with a deficiency for something that they evolved to need. There's an ongoing mental health crisis with the primary demographics of this brainwashing most affected with this destruction of culture and beliefs. When you destroy meaning and objective truth, you end up with a depressed and confused group of people. Some have argued that this whole crisis is due to the acceptance and belief of mental illness, and that it hasn't actually really increased. But suicide rates have also increased, where even though suicide has always been a thing that's been recognized to exist and has been generally viewed as a way out, others have argued that this is just due to the loneliness epidemic, yet the proportion of people who are lonely is much more smaller than the proportion of people with mental illness.
Why? Because it's the deepest impulse of a Jew's soul to pull at the very fabric of life till there's nothing left but a thread. They want nothing but nothingness. Nothingness without end.
Wow. Danny, this is great. You're incredibly articulate. But one thing. How can you believe all of this when you're a Jew yourself?
Excuse me?